Hello there tonight. We are going to peel back the velvet curtains and creep through the perfumed shadows of Queen Elizabeth I's court. Not to marvel at its splendor, but to examine what it really smelled like. We're stepping into a world of satin and stench sugar and rot, where a dazzling smile might be made of blackened teeth and a sweet scent might only mask something sour beneath. You're about to walk through a royal palace where water was feared, perfume was sacred, and cleanliness, well, it was more of a costume. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. Let's begin with something deceptively innocent. A little craving. A tiny indulgence. Sugar. It began innocently enough, small candied violets plucked from the gardens, or preserved fruits soaked in rosewater syrup. Little luxuries fit for a monarch. But for Queen Elizabeth, sugar wasn't a treat. It was a habit, and soon a dependency. She didn't just enjoy it, she used it, flaunted it, ruled with it. Sugar was power, sugar was wealth, and in her gilded world it was everywhere. She dipped her fingers into marzipan, shaped like swans, sipped from goblets, laced with clove-infused syrup, and nibbled delicacies molded from almond paste and sugar-crusted rose petals. Royal banquets featured entire sugar sculptures, temples, gods, even ships meant to be admired, then devoured. But beneath the glitter of those sugary displays, something darker was brewing. Quite literally. Her teeth. Now it's worth remembering that dental care in the 1500s was less self-care routine and more grit your teeth and hope it doesn't hurt too much. Most people rubbed their teeth with a cloth or chewed on minty twigs. But Elizabeth she had her own toothpaste recipe made with honey herbs, and you guessed it, sugar. Yes, sugar. The very thing rotting her teeth was the thing she used to try and clean them. If you're wincing a little right now, you're not alone. Foreign visitors at her court often remarked, not always politely, on the state of her smile. By the 1590s, her teeth were blackened, broken, and in some cases gone entirely. Her speech became slurred. Her breath, according to one source, could wilt flowers, and still she refused to have them removed. Not because she thought they were salvageable, but because she feared the pain. One nobleman, braver or perhaps more sycophantic than wise, offered to have one of his teeth pulled in front of her, just to show it wasn't fatal. He screamed reportedly, but Elizabeth didn't budge. Now here's the twist that makes this whole rotting mouth affair even more bizarre. Instead of mocking her, the women of the court imitated her. They blackened their own teeth. On purpose, with soot, with charcoal, with ink even. Because if the queen had black teeth, then black teeth meant beauty, meant power, meant favor. A white smile that was for milkmaids and merchants, but a mouth like shadows that was the new fashion. Historians still debate whether this trend started organically or was subtly enforced by Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting. Maybe it was flattery. Maybe it was fear. Maybe they just wanted to keep their heads. But either way, it worked. In her court, even decay became divine. It's strange, isn't it? How power can warp beauty. How sickness, when worn by a monarch, becomes chic. There's a lesson somewhere in that, something about how far people will go to match an ideal, even if that ideal is crumbling from the inside out. And so Elizabeth the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, continued her reign with a mouthful of rot and a court full of imitators. But sugar didn't stop at her teeth. It ran in her veins, in her moods, in her energy swings. And in those long, late-night council meetings, when even the courtiers were struggling to stay upright, she would sip on spiced wine and nibble gingerbread laced with molasses. It kept her going. and maybe in some twisted way, it kept her safe. Because in a court where sweetness equaled control, bitter truth had no place. Of course, that sweetness came at a cost. Behind the scented handkerchiefs and powdered collars, behind the witty banter and perfectly timed glances, the queen's body was quietly surrendering. Each molar that cracked, each breath that turned heads for all the wrong reasons. Each time she turned away from a mirror or banned one altogether. It was her body whispering truths she couldn't afford to speak aloud. And the irony, for all her obsession with appearances, her legacy, what people remember most often begins with that ruined smile, the blackened teeth, the sweet tooth that ate away at a legend. So next time you see a portrait of her white face, red hair, jeweled collar, you might imagine what lies just beneath that closed, regal mouth. Not a smile, but a secret, and it tasted like sugar. The thing about royalty in the 16th century is that it smelled a lot better in theory than it did in practice. If you'd stepped into Queen Elizabeth I's court expecting a cloud of rose petals and fresh linens, you'd have been half right. Because yes, the scent was there, lavender cloves, crushed violets floating in rose water. But it wasn't cleanliness you were smelling. It was camouflage. A glorious, expensive, obsessive camouflage. Let's get something straight. Elizabeth didn't fear sweat because it was unpleasant. She feared it because it was human. And if there was one thing she spent her reign avoiding, it was looking human. Soap in her world was less popular than suspicion. Water was feared like a plague, quite literally, and bodily functions were considered dangerous not just physically, but symbolically. This wasn't about hygiene. It was about hierarchy. And so instead of washing her skin, Elizabeth drenched it. In fragrance, in oil, in vinegar infused with herbs grown in her own palace gardens. Everything had a smell, her gloves, her gowns, even the handkerchiefs she carried and sometimes pressed to her face with just the right amount of theatrical flourish. This wasn't personal care. It was performance art. Let's talk about the gloves. Oh, the gloves. They were perfumed with ambergris musk, or civet scents so intense and long-lasting, they could outlive the person wearing them. The queen would gift these gloves to favored courtiers, a subtle message of favor and dominance. "I smell divine," it said. "You do too because of me." And let's not overlook the scented pomanders, little decorative orbs filled with resin herbs and spices. Elizabeth wore them on her belt or tucked them into her sleeves. Whenever someone stinky wandered too close, she could simply lift her wrist, inhale, and carry on like the world around her didn't reek of chamber pots and unwashed linen. But perhaps the most theatrical part of her scent routine was her daily washing. There was no soap, no scrubbing. Instead, her ladies-in-waiting would dab her skin with cloths soaked in vinegar, rosewater, or myrtle. A pat behind the ears, a stroke across the collarbone. Sometimes it took an hour. Not because of thoroughness, but because it was ritual. Every movement was precise, every moment intentional. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth actually believed these daily ablutions were cleansing, or whether she simply understood the power of illusion. The answer, as with most things Elizabethan, is probably both. You see, she didn't want to be clean in the way we understand it. She wanted to be untouched, unreachable. If soap was for the common folk, then scent was for the divine. And Elizabeth, she wasn't just queen, she was Gloriana. Now here's the truly strange part, because perfume wasn't just used on her body. It was used on everything around her. Her rooms were smoked with herbal incense. Floors were strewn with rushes soaked in oil. Even the walls were sometimes rubbed down with aromatic waters. Visitors might leave her presence with the scent of her clinging to their sleeves. A subtle power move, don't you think? It's hard to describe just how far this obsession went. There are records, quiet little notes in the royal household accounts of barrels of rosewater being delivered, of dried herbs by the pound, of imported spices costing more than entire suits of armor. And still the queen never truly smelled clean, not by modern standards. Because under all of that, beneath the layers of silk and the scented gloves and the dabs of myrtle oil, there was sweat and skin, and the human smell that no amount of perfume could quite erase. But she tried. Oh, how she tried. And here's the kicker: people believed it. They wrote about her as if she were made of lilies and air. They described her presence as light and floral. The scent of her was remembered long after her words. That's the power of repetition, of ritual, of wrapping your body in layers of myth. She may have skipped the bath, but she never skipped the illusion. Even her hair smelled of sweet almond and clove. Her pillows were stuffed with lavender. Her gowns were spritzed with orange blossom. She turned her body into a walking garden and hoped no one would ever get close enough to catch the truth. And yet the truth always lingered, because perfume fades and sweat doesn't ask for permission. Still, she walked those halls as if the scent trailing behind her could rewrite reality, as if it could cleanse not just her skin, but the court itself. It didn't, but it came awfully close. In fact, centuries later, when historians began cataloging her personal effects, the gloves, the pomanders, the handwritten instructions for distilling scent, they noted something odd. Elizabeth's formulas were stronger, more complex, and more obsessive than any of her contemporaries. They were industrial-strength elegance, a counterspell against decay, a war waged through scent, and she fought it every single day. So the next time you spritz a bit of perfume before heading out, remember you're part of a long tradition. One that began not in a cosmetics aisle but in a Tudor palace where a queen believed that roses could silence rot. There's something ghostly about her portraits, isn't there? The way her skin glows like moonlight, smooth, cold, untouchable. Her face is a pale oval framed by red curls, her eyes steady, her lips barely curved. She looks like she's never aged a day. That wasn't an accident. Elizabeth's face wasn't just a canvas. It was a performance in itself, a porcelain mask of power. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Hiding beneath that alabaster glow, the very thing that made her look immortal was killing her. Slowly, quietly, one toxic stroke at a time. Let's start with what she used. Venetian ceruse. A name that sounds lovely, doesn't it? Like lace or lace curtains. But it was deadly. It was a thick white paste made from vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead. The same stuff you don't want anywhere near your plumbing, let alone your bloodstream. Every morning, Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting would apply it to her face in smooth, even layers. Not too thin imperfections must be erased. Not too thick, or it would crack. It covered scars, pimples, freckles, fine lines. Everything that marked her as human. And she wore it all day, every day. The longer she wore it, the more damage it did. Lead doesn't just sit on your skin. It soaks in. It poisons your blood scars, your tissues, and leaves your skin, ironically, more blemished than before. So what did she do when her face began to react? She added more. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth understood the danger. Some argue she must have known, based on the symptoms: rashes, open sores, skin so fragile it peeled in sheets. Others believe she was simply doing what every noblewoman did at the time, only more obsessively. Whatever the truth, the effect was unmistakable. Over the years, her real face faded away. What remained was a mask. Frozen, flawless, fragile. And yet the makeup was just the beginning. To complete the look she used, rouge made from cinnabar. Another cheerful name hiding a dark truth. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide. Yes, mercury. Applied to the cheeks and lips, it gave her that signature reddish glow. And it did more than stain her skin. It changed her. Her moods grew erratic. Her memory weakened. Her hands sometimes trembled when she held a goblet or signed a decree. She grew paranoid, more controlling, more isolated. All textbook signs of audaritai, mercury poisoning. But no one dared tell her, and if they did, she didn't listen. Because Elizabeth didn't see herself as a person. She was the state. The image in the portrait. The unchanging symbol of a stable England. To let her face age even a little was to risk everything. Pain acceptable, poison manageable. Cracks in the mask, never. It's said that in her final years, she banned mirrors from her chambers. She didn't want to see the damage, or maybe she already knew. One servant's job, his only job, was to gently powder her shoulders in private so no one would ever glimpse her real skin beneath the gown. Can you imagine that? A human body so sacred, so symbolic, it had to be powdered like porcelain, tended like an artifact, and yet still decaying. She stopped letting artists paint her from life. Instead, they were instructed to use face patterns, copies of earlier portraits, so her image remained eternally 30. Whether she was 35 or 57, her official likeness never changed. Every portrait was a lie, a beautiful one, but a lie nonetheless. And here's the twist those lies worked. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about her eternal youth. Visitors bowed before her with reverence, believing they were in the presence of a living goddess. Even her enemies feared the image more than the woman. That's the terrifying power of good makeup. Now, in between all this, between the layers of lead and mercury, the powdered wigs and painted lips, there's a small, haunting truth. Elizabeth never married. She never had children. Her body never belonged to anyone but the crown. And maybe, just maybe, that was part of why she painted it so thoroughly. To protect it, to hide it, to keep it from being claimed. Historians whisper that she once fell ill, and the doctors feared they might have to peel away her makeup to treat her. The thought horrified her. She reportedly begged them not to remove it, not because she was vain, but because she was terrified of what people would see. Because if they saw her skin, her real aging, blistered skin, they might stop believing in her. And if they stopped believing, well, what was a queen without her legend? So she continued the ritual. Every morning, ceruse on the cheeks, cinnabar on the lips, a layer of powder, a dab of oil, a precise arrangement of hair, either her own stiffened with egg whites, or later in life wigs styled into curls. And then she'd sit and rule and smile carefully so as not to crack the mask. In the end, Elizabeth I died, not with dignity, but with her courtiers too frightened to move her body. She'd refused to go to bed for days, standing in silence, fingers trembling on a scented cane. Maybe she knew the mask was failing, that the performance had ended, that the truth, however briefly, was seeping through the paint. But she never let them see. Not really. Even as her body betrayed her, her legend held firm. Because when people remember her today, they don't picture the sores, the trembling hands, the powder caked along her jawline. They see the mask, the white, perfect royal face. And maybe that was the point all along. There's something oddly intimate about laundry in the 16th century, especially royal laundry. When we think of hygiene today, we picture showers, soap, maybe a 10-step skincare routine with serums and scrubs. But back in Elizabethan times, particularly in the royal court, being clean didn't mean water or washing. It meant linen. Crisp, white linen. And for Queen Elizabeth I, linen wasn't just underwear, it was a full-body ritual. Let me paint a picture. You wake up in the cold, stone chamber of one of the Queen's many palaces. The sun hasn't even crested the horizon yet, but already maids are stirring. The Queen's sleeping quarters smell faintly of lavender and vinegar, the remnants of last night's perfumes evaporating into morning chill. On a stool by the bed are several fresh shifts, soft, bleached, pressed garments meant to be worn closest to the skin. Elizabeth never wore the same one twice in a day. In fact, she might change 3, 4 sometimes. 5 times. In a single day, each shift carefully peeled away and replaced by fresh cloth as if changing skin. These shifts were believed to absorb sweat dirt and toxins from the body. The more frequently they were changed, the cleaner she was considered. This was the philosophy of the age. The body expels and linen receives. It's weirdly poetic and slightly horrifying when you remember that this entire system functioned in place of actual bathing. Water, as we've covered, was feared. It was thought to open the pores too much, allowing in bad air, miasma, that could lead to plague fever or worse. But linen was safe, clean, holy even. It was a second skin, one that could be removed, boiled, and burned if necessary, and Elizabeth surrounded herself with it. Her royal laundry was a machine in itself. Dozens of washerwomen worked year-round, soaking the linen in lye, pounding it clean with paddles, then drying it on lavender bushes to absorb scent. Each piece was logged, embroidered with a small mark, and returned folded like origami, stacked sorted, ready for another day of absorbing the Queen's humanity. And it wasn't just shifts. She had linen gloves, linen handkerchiefs, linen caps beneath her wigs, linen pads inside her sleeves to absorb sweat. Her wardrobe included hundreds of pieces, all rotating in and out of use. But here's where things get strange, because for all this cleanliness by fabric, no one was actually washing the Queen. Her skin might not have touched water for weeks, even months. Yet to her courtiers, she gleamed, because linen didn't just absorb, it projected. Every fresh change sent a message: I am not touched by decay. I am not vulnerable. I do not sweat like you. And her servants knew it. One lady-in-waiting reportedly described the process as clothing the morning sun. Another noted that Elizabeth's shifts were so fine they passed through a ring. Imagine slipping something that delicate over skin marked by lead rashes and old scars. The contrast must have been stark, and yet it worked. Every shift hid the truth. Every layer made her more than human, and those who touched the linen, they weren't just launderers. They were keepers of secrets. Trusted women, often older, always discreet. They handled the undergarments of a woman whose body no one was supposed to imagine, let alone see. In Elizabeth's court, your job might have been to hand her a handkerchief, but if that handkerchief came from the wrong stack, if it smelled stale or carried the trace of last week's lavender oil instead of today's rose, that was your neck. This obsession with cleanliness via textile extended beyond her body and into her surroundings. Furniture was covered in fabric, soft-scented, often embroidered. Chairs had removable cushions. Pillows were regularly aired. Curtains were changed. Even her dogs, yes, she had lapdogs, were known to wear little collars of fine linen, sometimes perfumed. And remember, all of this was happening in a palace with no plumbing, no sinks, no bathtubs, only buckets, bowls, and cloth. Now here's a wrinkle in the story. Quite literally, linen wrinkles. Badly. Especially after being boiled, stretched, and dried in sun. So Elizabeth didn't just need fresh linen, she needed pressed linen. And that meant a team of hot stone ironers working in a special room with warm bricks, heavy glass weights, and wide wood tables. The sound of irons thumping onto fabric became part of the daily palace rhythm. Some say she could hear it through the walls and found it comforting, like a kind of textile lullaby. Others say she never noticed, because by then she had stopped noticing almost anything but the layers between herself and the world. You see, the longer her reign stretched on, the more rigid her rituals became. She no longer chose her shifts. She no longer touched her gowns. She was dressed, turned, arranged. Her body had become another surface to be decorated, folded, and pinned. And sometimes during those long hours of dressing, she'd simply stare ahead, silent, letting it all happen. Letting the linen carry the weight of her body for one more day. One courtier wrote that touching the Queen's linen was like folding clouds. Another called it the breath of royalty. Historians still debate whether she actually believed this method kept her clean, or whether it was simply another wall, another illusion she was willing to live behind. But either way, one thing is clear. Her shifts were more than clothing. They were armor. Soft, white, silent armor, soaked with lavender and sown with denial. So the next time you slip into a fresh shirt or curl beneath freshly laundered sheets, take a second to think about the queen who lived and died by fabric, who changed her linen more often than she spoke the truth, who let cotton carry her sweat because water might carry her humanity, and who, for all her fear of bathing, left behind a wardrobe so clean it almost sparkled. Almost. Because under every spotless shift was the same skin, still unwashed, still afraid, still human. If you've ever heard someone refer to the throne as a symbol of power, you probably weren't meant to take it literally. But in Queen Elizabeth I's court, the throne wasn't just a gilded chair in a council room, it was also a wooden box with a hole in it. Yes, we're talking about the royal toilet. It was called the close stool, and it was frankly more stool than close. From the outside, it looked elegant enough. Carved wood, padded seat, perhaps even draped with fine velvet. But lift that seat, and you'd find a ceramic chamber pot snugly tucked inside. No plumbing, no flushing, just a very royal pot that someone had to empty. And here's the kicker, that someone wasn't a servant. It was a nobleman, a very powerful one actually. The Kakte, groom of the stool. As he was officially titled, was not only responsible for assisting the queen in her most private moments, yes, including wiping, but also served as one of her closest advisors. The job came with enormous trust, enormous access, and shockingly enormous influence. Imagine at one moment you're holding a perfumed cloth in the queen's private chambers. The next, you're whispering in her ear about foreign ambassadors and council gossip. All because you'd proven you could handle her most delicate business with discretion. Historians still debate whether the position originated purely out of necessity or evolved into a political tool. But one thing is certain, there was power in proximity. And no one got closer than the groom of the stool. Now let's talk about how all this actually worked. Because while Elizabeth's personal commode might have been cleaned with rose water and discreetly handled by a titled gentleman, the rest of the palace was a different story. There were no proper bathrooms, no plumbing, no sanitation, just chamber pots, bowls, buckets, and they were everywhere. Behind tapestries, under stairs, in corners of rooms so grand you'd assume they were only meant for court dances and state dinners. But somewhere in every hallway, someone had peed in a bowl and left it to be dealt with later. That later fell on the shoulders of the Kakachik Gong farmers, or Chukter, night soil men. A group of workers who deserve far more credit than history ever gives them. They worked at night naturally because no one wanted to see them creeping through palace halls with iron hooks and sloshing buckets collecting the waste of the nobility. Their job was to descend into the cesspits beneath the palace, often by ladder scoop, out the filth by hand, and haul it to nearby fields or rivers. It was back-breaking, soul-sapping work. And it smelled exactly like you're imagining. Only worse. To cover the odor, the palace burned herbs, sprinkled dried flowers on the rush mats, laid down scented straw. But these layers of sweetness quickly absorbed the rot beneath them. Dust, dirt, hair, bits of food, and bodily fluids all gathered in the rushes, forming a carpet of decay hidden just beneath your feet. The floors may have glittered by torchlight, but one step too deep into the corner, and your slipper came back. Squishy. Still the illusion held. Guests walked through the palace, breathing through embroidered handkerchiefs. Courtiers spritzed their wrists with citrus oils. Queen Elizabeth herself carried a scented cane, a thin walking stick hollowed out and filled with herbs. Whenever someone particularly smelly approached, she would lift it to her nose casually, as if to say, "I am above this. I am untouchable." She wasn't. Because even with all the perfume, even with all the ceremony, her waste had to go somewhere. And often it didn't go far. Cesspits were known to overflow. Buckets were dropped on stairs. Sometimes the wind carried the smell up from the fields outside. And so Elizabeth moved, literally. She didn't stay in one palace for too long. Partly for politics, yes, but partly to escape the stink. By the time the stench became unbearable, even to those used to it, she'd pack up the court and move to the next royal residence. Whitehall, Hampton Court, Windsor. A constant stately game of musical chairs played to outrun her own bodily evidence. It's almost funny, isn't it? The most powerful woman in England constantly fleeing her own toilets. And yet she was praised for her cleanliness. She was the scented queen, the immaculate monarch. Because people didn't care about the cesspits. They cared about the mask, about the image. And that image was curated down to the very seat she sat on. Let's go back to that close stool for a moment. Because while it may seem grotesque, it tells us everything we need to know about Elizabeth's reign. It looked like a throne. It smelled like lavender. It was touched only by noble hands, but it was still just a box with a hole in it. No matter how many perfumes were added, no matter how beautiful the woodwork, it was still a place where even a queen had to go. And yet because she was queen, it became sacred, symbolic, even political. Because in Elizabeth's world, control over the body meant control over perception. To reveal too much of either would be to unravel the illusion. So she sat on that chair in her layers of scented linen behind her mask of white lead and ruled with one hand on her perfumed cane. A woman who could not be seen sweating aging or relieving herself without endangering the very idea of monarchy. And that more than any golden crown or jeweled robe is what made her reign so legendary. She didn't just govern, she performed, even in the bathroom. Let's take a walk. Well, a delicate glide through Elizabeth's palaces. Not just one, mind you. Because Elizabeth didn't stay in a single royal residence for long. She was constantly moving. From Whitehall to Greenwich, from Richmond to Nonsuch. Not just for ceremony. Not just to show the flag. She moved to outrun the stench. Yes, the smell. Royal palaces in the 1500s may have been architectural marvels from the outside turrets rising above meadows, fountains trickling in marble courtyards. But on the inside, they stank. Let's be clear. There was no indoor plumbing. There were no sewage systems, no flush toilets, no underground pipes. Just waste human-animal culinary piling up, seeping into walls, soaking into the straw-covered floors. There were rushes and tapestries and curtains, yes, but they did more to trap odors than remove them. And Elizabeth, with her famously sensitive nose and near-obsessive ritual of scenting everything around her, simply couldn't stand it. So she moved, not once a year, not once a season. She moved her entire court multiple times a month. This constant migration was known as the Royal Progress, a grand tour in theory showcasing the Queen's presence across her realm. But in practice, it was often just an elegant escape plan. Because by the time one palace had soaked in the stench of 300 courtiers, 40 dogs, 60 kitchen workers, and all their assorted bodily functions, it became unbearable. She wouldn't announce it. She wouldn't complain. She'd simply summon her attendants, have her wigs packed in padded boxes, wrap her scented gloves in linen sachets, and leave. Sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the heat of summer, when the Thames reeked of fish guts and feces. Sometimes in winter, when the fireplaces couldn't burn hot enough to cover the mold in the stone walls. She knew exactly when to vanish just before the smell overtook the silk. And where she went, everything followed. The beds, the trunks of gowns, the perfumed fans and pomanders. The entire court of jesters, secretaries, bodyguards, falconers, poets, cooks, and yes, grooms of the stool. All of them trailed behind her in a cloud of scented dust like the world's most glamorous evacuation drill. Historians still debate whether the progresses were truly political, designed to build loyalty across the land, or simply practical, the only way to keep the queen from retching into a perfumed handkerchief. Probably both. But what we do know is this: when she arrived at a new palace, there was an army waiting. Not soldiers, moyen cleaners, and they'd been sent ahead days before to scrub, polish, and deodorize every visible surface. The floors were scattered with fresh herbs, mint, sweet marjoram, lavender, crushed underfoot to release scent. The rushes were changed, curtains beaten, walls wiped with vinegar. Even the fireplace smoke was perfumed sometimes with frankincense or cinnamon. And yet, the illusion never lasted. Because people are people. And when you cram hundreds of humans into rooms designed for 50, the air starts to change. Fast. There were no real bathrooms, just buckets tucked behind tapestries, chamber pots slid under beds, waste piled up in hidden corners. And even with grooms of the stool and armies of maids, there was always too much body for the architecture to contain. So within weeks, sometimes days, Elizabeth would grow restless. The rosewater didn't cover the sweat anymore. The cinnamon smoke started to remind her of something sour. The lavender rushes smelled faintly like dog, and she'd start asking about the next palace. It was a never-ending cycle, and she knew it. She even joked once that her court was like a ship constantly in motion, constantly leaking. Only instead of water, it was leaking everything else. One ambassador from Spain reportedly fainted during an audience, not from nerves, but from the sheer closeness of so many heavily perfumed courtiers pressed into one narrow hall. Others wrote home about the stale air of the inner chambers, noting that even the queen herself occasionally waved a handkerchief in front of her face while smiling. Subtle, regal, and utterly desperate. The queen's relationship with scent was not just practical, it was philosophical. For her to smell bad was to lose power. To stink was to be human. And to be human was to be vulnerable. So she wrapped herself in the illusion of fragrance. And when the palace broke that illusion, she left. It's strange, isn't it? How one of the greatest rulers in English history spent so much of her time fleeing her own walls. Not from enemies, not from threats, but from something far more embarrassing. From latent decay. And not just physical decay, but social, symbolic, royal decay. The kind that starts quietly. A whisper in a hallway. A glance from a lady in waiting. A moment when someone notices that beneath the powdered wigs and leaded cheeks, there is a woman who needs air. So she moved, and moved, and moved again. She didn't wait for the smell to prove she was mortal. She stayed one scented step ahead of it. In the end, Elizabeth ruled not from a throne, but from a series of freshened rooms. And perhaps that's the most telling detail of all. She never let the stench settle, because she knew, once it did, it would settle on her. Let's talk about hair. Not the kind you brush into a perfect ponytail before bed, or tuck behind your ear while scrolling late at night. No, let's talk about royal hair. Hair that had to hold its shape through hours of ceremony, carry the weight of pearls and pins, and survive under heavy wigs without ever being seen wet. Hair for Queen Elizabeth, I was not something you washed. It was something you constructed. Now Elizabeth was born a redhead, bright, fiery, unmistakably Tudor. And for the first part of her reign, she flaunted it. Her portraits from her 30s show a soft auburn halo swept up into elegant curls or woven into intricate styles. But that natural hair, you weren't supposed to see it move. You weren't supposed to wonder how it felt or smelled. Because like everything else about her, Elizabeth's hair was performative. And washing it dangerous. Water was already feared for the skin, but for the scalp exposed tender close to the brain, it was downright reckless. Many believed that wetting the head could lead to fever madness, even death. And so Elizabeth followed the rule, don't wash style. Stiffen, scent, hide. Her hair was set using a mixture of egg whites and sugar water. Brushed carefully through the strands and left to dry stiff as parchment. This created a kind of Tudor hairspray, gluey, fragile, but effective. The result, curls that didn't move, waves that held for hours, a crown of hair as still and pale as a statue's. But there was a catch. It only worked until it didn't. Sweat, humidity, body heat, any of these could melt the structure. And so the queen had to sit still. Very still. Her head movements were subtle, her nods deliberate. Her laughter, if it came at all, was shallow and carefully angled. This is the real reason Elizabeth moved like a ghost in portraits. Not because she was reserved, but because one wrong twitch and the sugar would crack. As she aged, her hair began to thin, likely from decades of wearing heavy wigs from chemical damage caused by lead makeup, and from the general malnourishment of royal beauty routines that prioritized image over health. Historians still debate whether it was mercury stress or simple genetics that triggered the hair loss. But by her 50s, Elizabeth was no longer styling her real hair at all. She had turned to wigs, and not just any wigs. Auburn wigs, made to mimic her younger self. They were thick, structured, and nearly identical, as if time had paused somewhere around age 35. Her courtiers learned to never comment on the change. Her artists continued to paint the same cascade of reddish gold, regardless of what they saw in private. Her wigs were washed, powdered, and scented, but her real scalp, probably not. It remained beneath layers of linen caps and sugar-stiff netting. The few who saw it, maids perhaps, or her closest attendants, would never have dared speak about it. Because the hair wasn't just personal, it was political. To reveal the queen's thinning scalp would be like exposing the crown without its jewels. So they maintained the illusion. They stored the wigs on carved wooden heads, dusted them with rice powder and crushed lavender, carefully pinned them each morning with jeweled combs and silk veils, and Elizabeth wore them like armor, weighty, ornamental, untouchable. Here's the irony. For all her obsession with appearing ageless, the wigs aged her faster. The weight of them pulled on her neck. The powder irritated her scalp. The pins left red dents in her skin, and yet she wore them longer, tighter, heavier, as if to hold her face up by sheer force of decoration. It became a ritual, a form of worship, because her hair, like everything else, had become sacred by detachment. Think about this when you no longer touch your own skin or wash your own scalp or feel the wind move through your natural hair. You stop being a person. You become a figure, a statue, a story. Elizabeth became that story. She began giving her wigs names. Some were called after flowers, others after goddesses. She'd ask for Diana if she was meeting with a foreign envoy or Iris for courtly appearances. Each wig had its own personality, its own energy. It's said that if she arrived wearing Athena, the court knew to stay sharp. Something serious was about to unfold. Odd fact. She once refused an audience with a French ambassador because her wig had been singed by a fireplace the night before. She said she would not receive royalty in a state of disorder. The ambassador waited 4 days. No one questioned it. Because Elizabeth's hair, like her silence or her smile, was not just decoration. It was a message, and the message was, I do not decay. I do not shed. I do not age. Even if every brushstroke on her scalp told a different story. And then, of course, there were the accidents. The wig that slipped in the wind. The powder that made her sneeze mid-speech. The curls that melted during a hot summer progress. Each time the illusion trembled. But each time her courtiers turned away, pretending not to see. That's the heart of her power. Not that she never cracked, but that everyone agreed not to notice when she did. Elizabeth's real hair may have fallen out strand by strand. Her scalp may have itched, blistered, and scabbed beneath the wigs. But in the world she ruled, what mattered was what you saw. And what you saw was a perfect crown of red curls, as untouched by time as the portraits that never changed. Hair that never moved, hair that never grew, hair that even in death would still look the same. There was something magnetic about Queen Elizabeth II's presence, something larger than life. People often described her as radiant, composed, commanding. They wrote of her pale skin, her graceful hands, her carefully measured expressions. But very few wrote about her voice, and fewer still dared to mention what it smelled like when she spoke. If you stood close to Elizabeth, close enough to hear her whisper, commands, deliver scathing retorts, or offer icy pleasantries, you might have noticed something far less regal. Her breath. Hot, foul, rotten, so sharp it made people flinch. The truth is, by the time she reached her 50s, Queen Elizabeth II's teeth were in catastrophic condition. Most were discolored. Many were cracked, blackened, or loose. Some were entirely missing. The elegant woman in the portraits, the one with pearl drop earrings and an ageless gaze, was also a woman who could barely chew, barely speak, and who likely woke each morning with the raw pain of exposed nerves behind her royal smile. But you wouldn't have known that from looking at her, because the Queen's face, like everything else in her world, was carefully, obsessively curated. Let's rewind to how it all started. With sugar, Elizabeth didn't just enjoy sweets, she adored them. Candied violets, marzipan fruit, syrup-soaked pastries, honeyed almonds. Sugar in her drinks, sugar in her medicine, sugar sprinkled over dishes like it was a blessing. For the average English citizen, sugar was a luxury. For Elizabeth, it was daily life. She indulged openly and often. The Queen's sweet tooth was both personal pleasure and a display of wealth. Sugar was rare, imported, expensive, and she could have as much as she wanted. And yet at the same time, she wanted to stay clean, or rather to appear clean. So she brushed her teeth with what? A paste made of herbs and sugar. Yes, sugar. The same substance destroying her teeth was also part of her so-called dental hygiene. And if that wasn't enough, she occasionally used coarse powders made from crushed eggshells or chalk to polish her teeth, scraping away not just surface stains, but enamel. The result, her teeth didn't just decay, they collapsed. Visitors from abroad noticed. Ambassadors reported that her speech was difficult to understand. Her breath, they said, was sharp, sickly sweet, deeply unpleasant. Some sources claim she rarely opened her mouth in public by the end of her reign. When she did, she chose her words carefully, both for political impact and to minimize the risk of showing too much. But still, she refused to have the damaged teeth removed. Why? Because pain, yes, but also pride. A lost tooth wasn't just a hole in the mouth. It was a symbol of weakness. And Elizabeth, who had seen her own mother executed before she was 3 years old, who had navigated betrayal, rebellion, and near assassination, had learned never to show weakness, especially not in her body. Historians still debate how much Elizabeth understood about the consequences of her choices. Some argue that she didn't realize the extent of the damage, that she truly believed her scented pastes and perfumed breath were enough. Others believe she knew Hygiene and chose the mask anyway, because that's what it was. Not hygiene, not denial, a mask. There's a chilling story, half fact, half courtly legend, of a time when her counsel begged her to have a dangerously infected tooth extracted. It was turning black. It stank. It throbbed so badly she couldn't sleep. One brave courtier volunteered to have his tooth pulled in front of her to prove it was survivable. He screamed. She watched, impassive, and then she refused Vati anyway, because the idea of opening her mouth wide, of surrendering her body to someone else's hands, was worse than the pain. Instead, she used other tools to manage it. She carried pomanders, small scented orbs filled with dried herbs and spices. She would lift them discreetly to her nose when speaking with others. They were her shield, a soft, perfumed barrier between her breath and the world. Her chambers were drenched in floral oil. Her pillows were stuffed with lavender. She sucked cloves not just for flavor, but for their natural numbing properties. They may have soothed her gums temporarily, but they didn't solve the real issue. And here's where things get stranger, because rather than criticize her, rather than recoil, the women around her began copying her. That's right, they blackened their teeth. On purpose, using soot, charcoal, ink. The goal to match the queen. To appear as if they too were so fabulously wealthy, so aristocratic, that they had consumed enough sugar to rot their teeth. To rot your teeth became a fashion statement. Imagine that. Elizabeth standing before her court, with broken molars and bleeding gums, and her ladies-in-waiting standing behind her, smiling with artificially darkened smiles, proud to share the decay. It was more than mimicry, it was strategy. In a court where the queen's mood could dictate your fortune matching her appearance, was a form of survival. Just as they copied her makeup, her gowns, her hairstyles, they copied her smile, or what was left of it. And because no one dared question the queen's habits, not openly, this bizarre version of beauty continued, even flourished. It's like some grim fairy tale. The more her smile disintegrated, the more others praised it. The more her teeth turned black, the more they became a royal standard. But in private, her meals changed. She could no longer chew meat or tough bread. Her cooks prepared mushy dishes of porridge, stewed fruit, soft eggs, mashed root vegetables, elegant food for a rotting mouth. Sometimes it said she would leave banquets early, not because she was bored, but because the act of eating had become too painful. She avoided wine, it stung her gums. She drank herbal infusions instead. She stopped smiling altogether in some settings, because when your teeth are crumbling, a smile becomes a risk. Yet the queen continued her performances. She gave speeches. She received diplomats. She rallied troops. Even with her breath sour, her mouth aching, her jaw swollen. Her words may have been slurred, but they were still powerful. Because what mattered wasn't the clarity of her voice, it was the force behind it. What mattered wasn't how her teeth looked, but whether you believed in her legend. And the court, the kingdom, they did believe. They whispered, of course. Servants gossiped. Foreigners chuckled. But no one challenged the mask. Not openly. Because Elizabeth wasn't just a woman with bad breath. She was Gloriana. She was not the Virgin Queen. She was England. So what if her mouth reeked of death? Her words still ruled the living. There was a time long before the rashes and the rigid wigs and the perfumed walking sticks, when Elizabeth Tudor was simply a girl in a grand but uncertain world. A princess who'd watched her mother beheaded before her 3rd birthday. A teenager once imprisoned in the tower by her own sister. A woman who learned from a very young age that her body was not hers. Not really. By the time she became Queen Elizabeth II, she understood that every part of her smile, her skin, her voice, her movements, would be judged, interpreted, and politicized. Her body was a mirror, reflecting the strength of the crown. If she aged, the country aged. If she weakened, the nation faltered. And so she made a decision. She would never let them see her fall apart. not even as her body quietly slowly betrayed her. You see behind the lead paint and layers of linen behind the scented gloves and the rigid posture. There was a body falling to pieces. And perhaps no part of her daily life revealed that more than her desperate ongoing efforts to suppress the natural functions of that body. Let's talk about scent again. Not the warm sweetness of rosewater, not the clove or ambergris rubbed on her wrists, not the sugared violets kept beside her bed. Let's talk about odor. Elizabeth's body, like every human body, sweated. It digested, it flushed, it aged, and no amount of royalty could stop that. But she tried. Oh, how she tried. She created a world of fragrance. A constant, obsessive routine of covering, layering, perfuming, designed to ensure no one, not even those closest to her, ever caught a whiff of reality. Every day, her attendants brewed mixtures of herbs, resins, citrus peels, and vinegar in a room known as the still room. These were prepared with as much care as medicine and applied with almost religious reverence. A few drops behind the ears, a cloth soaked and dabbed along the collarbone, a scented handkerchief tucked in her sleeve. And if that wasn't enough, she carried pomanders, delicate metal orbs suspended on chains from her belt, filled with sweet-smelling materials. Dried rose petals, clove buds, myrrh. She would lift them to her nose with effortless grace, as if pausing to think when, in fact, she was bracing herself against the human scent of others, or perhaps her own. Some of these pomanders were so finely crafted, they became heirlooms. Others were gifts from foreign rulers, but all served the same purpose: to preserve the illusion of sanctity, touchet purity. And this was key, because in Elizabeth's mind, to smell like a woman was to be vulnerable. She didn't want to be known as flesh. She wanted to be known as meth. Historians have recovered written instructions from her household, detailing the precise recipes for these concoctions. One included a mix of rose petals, orange peel, cinnamon bark, and distilled spirits meant to be kept in small glass bottles, hidden inside bodices. Another called for crushed amber and benzoin resin mixed with crushed pearls. They weren't just perfumes. They were Bach barriers. Every whiff of lavender was a defense. Every drop of frankincense a fortress. But here's the uncomfortable part. None of it actually cleaned her. Elizabeth bathed infrequently. Perhaps once a month, perhaps less. When she did, it was an event, a ritual. Her ladies would heat buckets of water one by one, hauling them up stone staircases to fill a wooden tub lined with linen. They would lace the water with herbs, oils, maybe milk, and Elizabeth would lower herself carefully, slowly into the bath, as if entering a sacred pool. But most days there was bath. Only scent, only illusion. Her skin, fragile and rash-covered from decades of lead and mercury, was never scrubbed, only blotted, dabbed, layered with unguents. Her feet were sometimes washed, but only ceremonially. Her hair was rarely touched with water, only powdered, pinned, stiffened. And the older she got, the more untouchable she became. There are stories, whispers from the edge of history, of a servant whose job it was to powder her shoulders. In private. Just that. One person sworn to secrecy, allowed to see a flash of real skin, not to clean it, not to assess it, only to maintain the illusion. To ensure that should her gown slip or her sleeve shift, what showed beneath was not rash or scar, but marked white dust. White like porcelain, white like a statue, white like death. And slowly, quietly, Elizabeth's body responded. Her skin became thinner. It blistered, peeled, The makeup burned more deeply. The oils irritated. Her scalp flaked beneath the wigs. Her gums bled. Her stomach ached. Her limbs trembled. But no one could say anything, because the image held. The image always held, until it didn't. In her final years, Elizabeth refused to be seen. She stopped sitting for portraits. She avoided sunlight. She wouldn't allow mirrors in her rooms. She held court from behind fans and veils, her voice softer, slower. Her breath labored beneath layers of lace, but still she powdered. Still she perfumed. Still she kept the mask in place, even as the foundation beneath it cracked. There's something deeply tragic about this, because in the end, all her rituals, her scented gloves, her rosewater baths, her dozens of shifts, her pomanders, her wigs, her pressed lips were not just habits. They were protection. Protection from the one thing she feared most, being known. Not politically, not intellectually, but physically, viscerally. To be known as a woman with bad breath and body odor, with thinning hair and rotting teeth, with age spots and stretch marks and sores. To be real. And so she built a second skin, out of linen, out of fragrance, out of myth, and wore it every single day, until her very last. When she finally lay in bed, refusing food, speaking little, no longer moving from her chambers, her attendants tried to prepare her body. They brought oils, scented cloths, a fresh shift. But she waved them away. She would not be washed. She would not be exposed. And when she died, when England's greatest monarch finally slipped out of her cocoon of ceremony, it is said that her skin was so delicate, so damaged, that no one dared touch it. Not even to say goodbye. By the end, Queen Elizabeth I no longer ruled with words or with law or even with sheer force of will. She ruled with silence. Her body, once a symbol of virgin purity, of divine right, of immaculate strength, had begun to break down. Not all at once, not dramatically. That would have been too easy. No, Elizabeth unraveled slowly, delicately, like the unraveling hem of one of her embroidered gowns. Quietly enough that no one dared acknowledge it, but visibly enough that no one could fully ignore it either. She stopped appearing in public. She stopped speaking freely. She stopped sitting for portraits, stopped attending council meetings, stopped smiling. Her last official likeness had been painted years earlier, and even that was a lie. The smooth cheeks, the ageless skin, the glossy red hair, it was an echo, a memory. No artist was allowed to paint her true face again. Not because it had grown ugly, but because it had grown real. And Elizabeth no longer had use for reality. Her days became ritual, not of statecraft, but of self-preservation. Every morning, attendants brought shifts of bleached linen scented with dried lavender and pressed smooth as parchment. Her body, too frail for water, was gently wiped with cloths dipped in vinegar and rose oil. Not to cleanse, but to conceal. Not to comfort, but to maintain the illusion. And what an illusion it had become. Gone were the fire-lit speeches and clever political maneuvers. Gone were the late-night readings of poetry, the whispered conversations with foreign ambassadors. What remained was Alcase, a shell. A woman who could no longer eat solid food, who refused both doctors and mirrors, who drifted like a ghost from chair to window and back again. Still she wore the crown. Still she powdered her skin. Still her wigs were brushed each day and arranged with trembling care. But something had shifted. Where once she had worn her image like armor, now she wore it like a burden. Heavier than the jewels, more exhausting than the crown. She stopped sleeping. At first it was out of restlessness, then fear, then pure refusal. She sat upright in a padded chair wrapped in blankets, her eyes open, her gaze distant. When her maids pleaded with her to lie down, she whispered, Must I die lying down? It was the closest she ever came to admitting what everyone already knew. Her body was failing. Her legs, once so strong and practiced at ceremonial pacing, now trembled under her. Her hands shook when lifting a goblet. Her teeth were long gone, her gums inflamed, her speech slurred and slow. The perfumes she once adored now made her nauseous. The white makeup cracked against her skin. Her body, the sacred thing she had guarded so fiercely, had finally turned against her, and yet still, she refused to be touched. No physician was allowed to examine her. No servant could remove her final layers. When her ladies-in-waiting tried to adjust her clothing or loosen a stiff bodice, she flinched, waved them off. It wasn't pain, she feared it was exposure. The final unveiling of everything she had spent decades hiding. Because the truth was, this Elizabeth didn't fear death. She feared being seen. She feared the moment someone would look at her and no longer see a queen, no longer see Gloriana, just a woman. Old, sick, tired, mortal, so she sat in silence, day after day, breathing barely, eating not at all, surrounded by attendants too terrified to speak and too loyal to leave. They brought her letters. She waved them away. They brought her books. She could no longer read. They brought her poetry, her favorite verses, and still she said nothing. The only thing she allowed was powdering. One maid, perhaps two, were permitted to enter her private chamber each morning. Their task was simple and sacred, to apply white powder to her shoulders and chest, just in case a sleeve slipped or a collar shifted. Even now, at the edge of death, Elizabeth would not risk being seen as human. Her skin was so thin by then, so damaged from years of lead and mercury, that the powder clung like snow to cracked porcelain. It didn't hide the decay anymore. It only highlighted it. But still, she powdered. Because to not powder was to admit that the show was over, and Elizabeth. She had never learned how to stop performing. The court began to panic. Her privy council argued outside her doors. Who would govern, who would speak to her, who would dare ask her to name an heir, but no one went in, no one asked. Because even in silence, even in decline, her presence still ruled. Even broken, she was powerful, until one morning she didn't rise. She hadn't slept for days, hadn't spoken, hadn't eaten. She was slumped in her chair, her face angled toward the window, her fingers curled around the handle of her scented cane, and she was gone. Not dramatically, not loudly, just gone. There was no grand pronouncement, no final words, just silence. They dressed her carefully, slowly, not as a corpse, but as a queen. Her body was powdered one last time, her final wig placed gently on her brow, her hands gloved, her face painted with the same white mask she had worn every day of her reign. And they did not cry, not at first, because the woman who had died had already been gone for some time. What they mourned was the myth, Gloriana, the virgin queen, the untouchable goddess cloaked in pearls and perfume who had ruled with sharp eyes and sharper words. The woman who turned decay into fashion, who redefined beauty as silence and discipline and denial. She was England's mask, and in her death, that mask was finally set down. They laid her in a coffin of oak draped in white silk, laid sweet herbs around her body, burned incense until the air was thick with memory. The streets outside filled with crowds, though no one had seen her face in years. They wept for her anyway, not for the woman she was, but for the image she had created, that image they would carry forever. And so will we. Because when we think of Queen Elizabeth Farks, we don't picture cracked teeth or thinning hair. We don't picture the sores beneath the powder or the scent of vinegar behind her ears. We picture the mask, the lace, the red wig, the unwavering gaze, But now tonight we've peeled back the layers. We've seen the sweat, the fear, the quiet erosion beneath the paint. We've followed her through her powders, her perfumes, her refusal to bathe. We've heard her breath. We've felt her silence. And in doing so, we've met. Not a legend, but a woman. One who fought harder than any warrior not on the battlefield, but against time, against truth, against being known. And now, we let her go. Let her powder settle. Let her cane fall. Let her rest. Softly, finally, completely. And as you close your eyes tonight, take a breath. A real one. Let it be messy or sleepy or sweet. You're not a queen. You don't have to perform. You don't have to hide. You don't need a mask. You only need rest. So good night. Sleep deep. Sleep free. She's not watching anymore, and neither is the world.